Okay, guys at the back of the room, if I could just ask you to take the conversation outdoors, that'd be brilliant. All right, so I did promise you or warn you guys that this afternoon was going to be interesting, and as we've just heard, there was some fascinating stuff going on there with Comcast at scale, and just showing what the art of the future might start to look like. We've got Jamie Brooks here for the last session on our consumer identity track. No less fascinating, let me assure you. A completely different kind of challenge, but I think you're going to find this pretty interesting too. So once again, I'm going to get out of the way and let Jamie get on with it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the journey that we've been on over the last year and a half at Ellie Mae. But before we kind of get started, as I love to do, is let's talk about the roadmap and what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to do a quick introduction of who's Ellie Mae. You probably have never heard of us. We're not Freddie Mae. We're not related to any government organization. We are a software company, and we'll talk about what we do. We'll talk a little bit about the lending ecosystem. So as you guys would all imagine, the lending ecosystem is actually much more complex than most people understand. So we'll talk about what that is. We'll talk a little bit about what we call the Ellie Mae Encompass platform, or lending platform. So this is the platform that we're using and we're building to basically modernize and change how we do lending in this country. Then we'll talk about ultimately what the challenge is and how we went about solving that challenge. Okay, so who's Ellie Mae? As I said, we're not Freddie Mae. We're not a government organization. We're a software company. And what we do is we provide software solutions targeted at the residential mortgage industry. We were founded in '97, so we've been around for a while. We went public and did our IPO in 2011. We have about 1,200 employees. We currently process about 30% of all residential mortgages in the US. So no matter who your lender is, generally they probably touch our platform in some form, fashion, or manner. And last year, we're a real company with real profits. We generated about $1 million a day. So we're about $300 million a year in revenue. We're a profitable company. All right, so let's talk about the lending ecosystem. So let's start with you, the borrower. So you go out and you generally will find a realtor and go house shopping. This is the fun part, right? This is what we get excited about. Go look at houses on the weekend. Ultimately, you find the house that you love, and you say, I want to buy this thing. Most of us will then go to what we call a TPO, or a third-party originator, brokers, mortgage brokers. Or you may go to your bank and deal with a lender directly. The lenders then, in turn, have a bunch of relationships with partners, because those lenders have to know more about you. They have to prove who you are, how much money you make, how much is the house worth, all of these things. So then you have integrations with insurance companies to see, do you require flood insurance? Fraud companies, is this property related to some kind of fraudulent activity? Is somebody selling a house they don't own or have title to? The appraisal, is the house worth at least what you are lending against it? And credit, do you make what you say you make? And do you have liabilities, and what's your credit history? Those type of things. Ultimately, most lenders in the US don't service the mortgage. So most lenders originate the mortgage and then turn around, collateralize it, and sell it in the secondary market. So they sell it to investors, like Wells Fargo and Fannie. And then ultimately you have regulators in the industry. As you can imagine, especially after 2008 and the meltdown in the mortgage industry, there is high degree of regulation in the mortgage origination business. Huge. Like, I wish our CISO was here. He would tell you he's going through audits almost every other week about one compliance or another. So in a nutshell, these are all of our constituents. And the platform that we're building actually has to solve and deal with all of these different constituents. We don't deal with customers, just the lenders. We actually deal with our lenders, customers, borrowers. We deal with regulators. You have to provide certain information to regulators. We deal with investors. So those are people that when you collateralize these mortgages and sell them, you have to meet certain compliance regulation. And if you don't, you can't sell your mortgage. And what most originators, most lenders don't want to do is sit on a mortgage for 30 years. They want to originate it, they make a couple $1,000 bucks, they turn around and sell it. And basically their whole business model is originating, a couple $1,000 bucks, sell it. And they keep moving the money. That is the mortgage origination business. And then in our platform, we have a new set of constituents that we've never had before. So we have developers. So developers can either work for lenders, can work for the different constituents. We have lenders that work for partners. And those are folks who are basically using our platform to build solutions. And then we have ISVs. So we actually have a pretty complicated ecosystem of partners and other companies that actually take our technology and build solutions on top of it. Right? We have companies that will build consumer-facing products. So, you've heard of things like Rocket Mortgage. There's other competitors in the industry that will take that kind of idea and build that on top of our platform. So let's talk a little bit about the Encompass Lending Platform. This is our fancy name for this new platform that we're building out. So at the middle, you have all of the origination process. Now, most of this functionality has existed since '97. It's been around for a long time. We've built this up over the last 20 years or so. But what we're doing is we're going through this major transformation where we're taking these big monoliths, things like our LOS, our loans origination system, and breaking it down into microservices. As of today, we started this journey about a year and a half ago. As of today, we have about 60 microservices. And then we have some big monoliths that we're still kind of ripping apart. So on the platform, the idea is we have two set of constituents, broad constituents. We have lenders and we have partners. And then the partners have different portals. So think about it. There's different people interacting with this loan origination process. So you have folks like the loans officer. Those are folks who work for the bank, right? Those people underwrite your mortgage, do all the paper processing. We won't get into that. That's a big, long, complicated process. Then you have TPOs. Those are your brokers. So those are folks who generally don't work for the lender, but help you originate a mortgage anyways. As I said, the most common is mortgage brokers. Then you have customers. So those are the lenders, those are the borrowers themselves. So those are you and I when we apply for a mortgage. We have partners. So partners are all of those things that I talked about previously. Those are folks that we need as part of the ecosystem to originate the mortgage. The credit providers, the title, the appraisers, those type of things. Then we have developers. So one of the things that we've done is very consciously build an open API platform. So the notion is we actually want to open up what we're doing. Think of it as I said, the Salesforce, but in the mortgage industry. We want to open up our platform. We want to open capabilities so that not only our direct customers can use our platform, but third parties can use our platform to do all kinds of stuff. Then we have appraisers, right? So all these green boxes up here basically represent portals into the LOS, into this platform. And then what we've done is we've kind of built along open APIs so that our customers and third-party software companies can actually build their own software on top of the platform. Along the right here, we have a couple really core aspects of the platform. Things like Maven. Maven is a product name. Maven basically is a compliance engine. So as I talked about, when you originate a mortgage, at the end state is that that lender wants to sell that mortgage. In order to do so, that has to comply to certain regulation and laws. If it doesn't, that lender gets stuck with that mortgage. And they generally don't want to do that. So we have a compliance engine that sits on top of the platform that as the mortgage is being processed, it's checking for different compliance checks. Does it satisfy this? Does it satisfy this? Do I have the documentation? Have I done my disclosures? All of those things. Then we have mortgage returns. Mortgage returns is a CRM. So for relationship management. So the idea is, how do you take, say, somebody who gets a 5-year fixed mortgage, and they come up for renewal in 5 years. You want to make sure that in 4.5 years, maybe you start sending them emails, or you send something in the mail and say, hey, by the way, when you come up for renewal, you might want to talk to lender XYZ. So it's managing that whole customer relationship, not just the origination process, but that whole life cycle. So every time they come up, and we even do things, and we're starting to get into more complicated things where, we look at things like your age, and we can dictate or start speculating, hey, you may be having children soon, so therefore you might want a bigger house. So we send you emails to basically say, hey, if you're moving up, hey, contact your lender. So we really want to kind of manage that customer relationship as we go along. And then along the bottom, we have all of these integrations. And today we have about 600 of them. We actually have quite a few. And so what we do is we allow the lenders to dictate which credit providers to use, which appraisers to use. That's completely within their control. We just provide that connectivity. What we're trying to do, though, is get out of the business of building all these integrations and instead allow the partners to build the integrations. So if you want to come in and you want to generate revenue on top of our platform, go ahead and do that. Here's a set of APIs, here's a spec, you implement that spec, and now you can be a credit provider. Or you can be a title company that we interact with. And what we're trying to do is offload what we build, these integrations, to the partners. And by the way, the partners are financially incentivized because every time they use their service, they make a transaction fee. And of course, we take a little bit of that transaction fee. All right, so that gives you an idea of kind of this broad vision. What are we trying to do here? So let's talk specifically about identity and what we're here to talk about. So what's the challenge? So let me tell you a little bit more about the background. So I joined Ellie Mae about 2 years ago, actually 2 years ago on the 15th. And I originally was hired into the architecture group. And we went out and started doing product evaluations. Things like, how do we do identity? What are we going to do for an API gateway? Various other technologies. Then about 1.5 years ago, I was asked by our new CTO to move into a new role. The new role was a platform group. So we were starting this platform group. And within the platform group, identity was one of the core services. We have about 12 or 15 other services that we provide, but identity is one of those core ones. So we started with a team of 3. We are now a team of about 30, about 1.5 years. And so we formed the team March of last year, and August was our first release, first GA release. And then we subsequently did a GA release in December, and then did another release in March. And now we're into the cycle where we do monthly releases. So every month we try to release at least a service pack, if not a new set of features. So what's the challenge? So this is the challenge that was presented to me 1.5 years ago. We need basic and federated SSO. So we have about 12 or so products. Compliance, LOS, different portals that we have into the solution. We wanted to be able to say, not only can you log into our LOS or loans origination system, but you can log into our CRM, single sign-on. But not only that, we wanted to have situations where you could, as a consumer, i.e. a borrower, you could log into a lender's identity platform and then be redirected from that lender to us and use our platform as if nothing happened. So federated SSO has become a more and more issue. Now in the mortgage business, I like to say we are the honeypot of sensitive data. If you want PII, work for a mortgage company or a software company that serves the mortgage industry. We have your whole financial history. If you apply for a mortgage, you guys know this. You fill out everything, where you work, how much you make, how much your spouse makes, are you married, how many kids, their ages, all of these things. So we are the PII Mecca. And that's not a good thing in one respect. Because if you think about it, there is high target value, a high value target, which is us. So the other thing that we've really forced on our lenders is contextual MFA. That's a must-have. So for consumers, there was this notion of, so with lenders, you have an existing relationship. They bought your software, they've been working with you generally for years. With consumers, borrowers, you have no relationship to these folks. Think about it. You're up at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night on a Friday night, and you're shopping mortgage rates. What prevents you from going from your credit union to Bank of America, and then Bank of America to some other company. Nothing. So you can shop rates and even apply for mortgage applications before you even authenticate. And if you think about that for a minute, that's a pretty resounding thing. So we had to be able to support self-service registration and account management to consumers. Because in that case, if we don't, they don't use our products. They don't use our products, we go out of business. So we have about a dozen products. Each product is branded separately. So we have, as I said, products for the lenders, products for the consumers, products for the developers. These are all different products. And the directive that we got from our UX team was, thou shall make them look different. When you authenticate into the developer portal. In actuality, that identity that you do is actually transferable to other products. But our UX team really wanted to kind of drive the branding home. So branding was a big deal for us. So as I said, we have about 500 partner integrations, and we had to figure out how do we authenticate those 500 partners. We have about 1 million identities across, and that's not a typo, 10,000 or so security realms. So think about that. So we don't have a directory service. We don't have a graph database either. We actually literally have multi-tenant environment. And a lot of our bigger customers will actually have multiple tenants. Well, each tenant onto itself is an identity store with its own set of users and own set of credentials. And if you think about why we do this, so a lot of our bigger enterprise lenders will do things like they'll have a whole IT department. And that IT department will build solutions. And so they need a dev, test, QA, int, PEG environment. So they'll have separate tenants for each one. But generally, those IT folks don't have access to prod for all kind of compliance reasons. So what we had to do is figure out how do we authenticate against literally, it's probably more than 10,000 identity stores, and do it through a common look and feel, one login page. The other thing that I remember kind of sweating when I was told this is the service can't go down. Given the fact that this funds everything we do, if you can't authenticate into the platform, you can't use the platform. You can't use the platform, you go bankrupt. So carrier grade availability was absolutely critical. So when I was putting this presentation together, I thought long and hard and said, what did we learn over the last 3 years? What are the tangible takeaways that we had? So what I tried to do is group it in 3 different components. 1, in a highly regulated, compliance-driven organization, policy must drive access. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. 2, our CEO likes to use this phrase a lot. Automate everything automatable, which is there's no thought that you can manually patch a system. The system from development to production, 100% of that deployment has to be automated. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. And to add to that, our CISO, when we first started talking about, I obviously work in the engineering organization, when we talked about we as an engineering organization, we're going to own identity, he rightfully was pretty concerned. And so what he basically said is, anybody who touches that identity platform, everything has to be automatable and auditable. So we have to know when somebody's issued an OAuth credential. We have to know when you've added a new adapter to ping, or have changed the code that does password validation. All of that has to be automated. And number 3, system can't go down. Design for failure. So one of the things I didn't mention so far is we do everything in AWS. That was an initiative that we started, as I said, about 1.5 years ago. And not to dish AWS, but AWS does go down. And as I talked about previously, we as an identity platform can't. So we work very hard to figure out how do you build resiliency and redundancy into the system. So let's talk about each in turn. So before we kind of get too far into what we've done, I thought it was pretty important to talk about access control and different models for access control. So back up a minute. So we're building this microservices architecture. So we have all these microservices. And then inevitably we started debating, how do you control access across hundreds, if not thousands, of microservices? Because most of those microservices do not have an identity store and don't know anything about the users until that first API call hits it. So we looked at things like ACLs, access control lists. That's problematic. That's problematic for a number of reasons. Then we looked at RBAC. So we had a long debate about this. So let me tell you a little story. So our LOS, or loans origination system, has this notion of personas. So you're a loans officer, that's a persona, it gives you certain permissions. You're a document processor, that gives you certain personas. And so the belief as we built the microservices architecture was we would just take those personas and apply it across microservices. But if you think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'll give you an example. So we have a microservice for content management. So think about it. As we render pages dynamically, you have assets. Those assets are images, HTML, whatever. So we have a microservice for that serves up that content. Well, that content management system doesn't know anything about a loans officer, and nor should it. Something serving up, a GIF image or HTML should not know anything about the business context that it's serving content to. So then we looked at ABAC, attribute-based access control. And so the idea with attribute-based access control, as you guys all know, is as you ship around this identity between the different microservices, you ship around claims or assertions that tell you more about that user. Well, that was fine when we started with 5, 6 microservices. But as we kind of scaled up, what we found is every microservice basically wanted to do their own thing. And so what we had to do is basically bring in policy-based access control. So policy-based access control effectively is just a fancy name for attribute-based access control, but it's defined by policy. So what we started doing is working with our InfoSec folks and our product folks to define what are policies. So for example, we look at things like who the user is, who authenticated the user, and what resource are they trying to access. And that informs everything from what they can do in the system, how many entitlements we have to look at, whether they can do self-registration and access management. And so as we've kind of moved along this, what we did is we ended up settling on policy-based access control. And again, to reiterate, policies are driven by business requirements coming from product, as well as InfoSec requirements coming from our compliance teams. And what we've had to do is figure out how do we coalesce these things together and actually build a framework, access control framework that applies across hundreds of microservices. And all of those microservices, by the way, don't know anything about our LOS. So I want to give you an example of what we do. So this is a quick overview of one of the things that we've built out. So this is an example of a loans officer. So obviously a loans officer is accessing pretty sensitive data. And generally loans officers have access to mortgages that span clients, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of clients. So generally high value data that they're accessing. So we thought long and hard about how to approach this. So you basically have the web app. You have an API gateway that we've built from scratch. At the bottom, you have your identity provider. And along the right side, you have a set of microservices that we've built as we've gone along. So the first one is a claims provider. So the claims provider basically provides metadata about the user in a particular context. So if that user, for example, is accessing a loan, we take that user, Jamie Brooks, working for ABC, coming from this corporate network, but I'm now accessing the loan service. So I take all of that, I formulate that, I do a query against the claims provider and get a set of metadata that ultimately is used to control access to the loan service. So the loan service, you think about it as a CRUD service, to be able to access loans. You have an entitlement service. So at Ellie Mae, we use entitlement kind of weird. So we use the word entitlement. Do you have a license for that? So all of our licenses basically start out in Salesforce, integrate and percolate through the IT systems, and ultimately end up being exposed by that fulfillment service, the entitlement service. And at the bottom, we have this legacy service that we've had and had to continue using. Because as you interact with mortgages, loans that is, we have to lock the mortgage and release locks. So to deal with concurrency, we have this whole notion, this kind of legacy state or session service. So we have what I call the lender authentication service. So that is a state service so that as we interact with that loan and update it, we can lock it and release a lock, lock it and release a lock. So let's talk a little bit about how we deal with the average interaction. So the loans officer basically pulls up one of our applications. They're all single-page applications using things like Angular or React. So that's all good. Ultimately, they try to access a protected resource. What they do is they get redirected back to our identity provider. That identity provider, in this case, basically says, hey, you're an LO, you're trying to access some sensitive data here. And goes back with the loans officer and authenticates that user. And in our case, loans officer, 2-factor. We've made that across the board. So once that has been authenticated, we ultimately create a session in our loans authentication service. And again, the reason we have to do that is as that loans officer interacts with the loan, there's the locking and unlocking of that. And that is all dictated. Ultimately, if all that goes well, what we say is, does this user have access to use this product? Remember I talked about those portals at the top? Developer Connect, Consumer Connect, all those things. So what we do is we say, you've authenticated, we know what you're trying to authenticate against, which product. Do you have the license to do so? If all that goes well, we ultimately issue an opaque access token, a bearer token. So once that bearer token is in the web app, ultimately that web app loads up and starts making API calls. That API call hits the gateway. Once it hits the gateway, we have to do a couple things. Remember I said that legacy service that we have at the bottom to basically manage interactions with the loan? What the gateway does is actually goes back to the identity provider, does two things. Hey, identity provider, is this opaque access token still valid? Oh, and by the way, can you keep the session alive? So there's keep alive, that dotted line, where we basically say, hey, loan service, you got to keep the session alive. Because the session, remember, is not owned by the identity provider. It's actually owned by our LOS. In this case, the loan off service. So what we do is when we authenticate the access token, we get back some metadata about the user. So what we do is, you can see now the image has changed. Now we have a JOT. So we dynamically generate a JOT. It's a one-time JSON web token, by the way. That JOT is basically a one-time use only JOT. It's got an expiration of 30 seconds, I think, maybe 60 seconds. So what we do is then the gateway says, hey, when we authenticated the user, we said, do you have access to this product? Now what we're saying is, do you have access to this API? So we're doing more fine-grained access control. Then what we do is we go back. Okay, what we do is we go back and we talk to the claims provider. The claims provider basically provides more metadata that is contextual to the request, and ultimately, then we make a request to the loan service. The loan service takes all those attributes, makes a decision, and says, okay, you have access. Here's the loan. So we do all of this stuff in the span of about 100 milliseconds. Once it hits the gateway, we've had to optimize the hell out of this. I can tell you it's been a lot of work, a lot of caching to get to this point. So let me talk a little bit about continuous delivery. I'm going to make this really quick. So we talked about previously that we've had to automate everything. So this is our continuous delivery pipeline. Code gets checked in, and by the way, this is everything to do with ping-fed as well. Every single file that we get in ping-fed gets checked into get. Get ultimately fires the Jenkins jobs. The Jenkins job basically does two things. It reaches into Packer. Packer is an open source utility, and we bake AMIs. So we have this notion of immutable images. So once we bake an AMI, it has everything you need in that image, and it doesn't have to go anywhere else for it. Ultimately, then we use CloudFormation to take those AMIs, and we have a 3-step baking process. We use CloudFormation to bake EC2 instances. And then we put that behind an auto-scale group. And what you see along the left and right side is we automated all of our functional, penetration, code quality, and performance testing. So you see along the side, that's unit testing, code quality, and check marks. So that's static analysis. On the right side, you basically have pen testing, that's ZAP. We have load testing, and then we have pen testing. So that's all automated as part of this big process. So let me talk a little bit about resiliency. So this is our architecture in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into the detail, but effectively what we do is we run hot across regions with real-time replication. So every user that gets created in east gets replicated to west and vice versa. It's bidirectional, and the idea is if we lose a whole region, a user never even has to re-authenticate. They continue using the system as if they never know what happened. And the big thing that we used is what's called latency-based routing. So depending on where you're coming from, that controls which data center ultimately you hit. Last note is monitoring and alerting. As we built out this ecosystem, monitoring is a real big deal. So you can see here, these are actually real examples of we use things like SignalFX, XMatters, and HipChat to do real-time alerting. So we're a DevOps shop. So we basically monitor the system real-time throughout the day. So, a couple takeaways. I promise we'll be quick. Contextual access. One size does not fit all. In our case, we talked about lenders, we talked about consumers. We deal with every constituent differently. Whether we allow them to authenticate one-factor, two-factor, whether we allow them to use certain grant types, all of that is dictated based on who's accessing the system and what attributes they're accessing. Continuous delivery is better than delayed perfection. I think that's a pretty salient point, i.e. get stuff to market. And ultimately, don't avoid failure, embrace it.
Jane, thank you.